Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. Which brings us to that title, which already exists in the Criterion Collection at Spy number 285, but now we have a new release of this, and I have the Blu-ray here. It is a film from 1958, and it is from the filmmaker Andrzej Wajda, and the name of the work is, and please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation of the Polish language, but it is called Popiół I Diament, or in English, Ashes and Diamonds. This is the extraordinary film from 1958 from the filmmaker and artist Andrzej Wajda, and it is based upon the work by Jerzy Andrzejewski, and it stars Zbigniew Cybulski. This is the work, and again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation of the Polish language, but this is the work which is called Popiół I Diament, or in English, Ashes and Diamonds. The plot or story of Ashes and Diamonds, I think, could be described as focusing in on a group of people in this very specific place and time. This is Poland in 1945. Specifically, it is a very short time window, roughly 24 hours or so, starting on and around May 8th, 1945. So this is still during wartime, during World War II. But this point in time is very significant because this brings in the surrender of German forces and thus, officially speaking, the end of World War II in Europe, May 8th, spilling over into May 9th, 1945. But as the film starts, we are still in this wartime era, and specifically we meet a number of characters from the very get-go, at the very opening, Drewnovsky and Andrzej and Maciek, and they seem to be involved, or they are in this idyllic atmosphere and environment with the backdrop of a beautiful scene of nature and a church. So everything seems peaceful and idyllic, but this turns very cold and very cruel and very savage almost immediately, because we realize that these three men are involved in an assassination plot. And this is where the film Ashes and Diamonds becomes very complex, nuanced, ambiguously murky, and so challenging to the senses and to one's conceptions and perceptions of the war and the aftermath, and the broad sweep of history on the one hand, and the intimate nature of characters and individuals and their choices and the consequences of their choices, and how these two levels are so linked, such as to bring about the realization that indeed the broad sweep of history will affect the intimate nature of the character choices in very drastic and significant ways. And we see this immediately at the start of the film, and it carries over and it echoes all the way throughout up to the very end of this powerful, dynamic masterpiece, Ashes and Diamonds. So specifically, we meet these three young men, and they are involved in this assassination plot. As we get more into the details, we realize that these three men, included in which is the Cybulski character, Maciek, and they are or were involved in the Polish nationalist home army effort, the AK, and their efforts bring with them the history and their sort of military, their experiences in the military forces during the war as against the Nazis and also against the communists. So it's in a sense a type of two-front effort on the part of the Polish national forces, or nationalistic forces. And so here we have one of those confrontations expressed, because the target of their assassination plot, as ordered by some authority figure whom we will meet later, is, we understand, a member of the local Polish Communist Party, the District Workers' Party. And we understand the target of the assassination plot is an individual in such position in the Communist Party whose name is Stuka. So they are assigned with the assassination of Stuka, this figure in the Communist Party. However, we soon realize that these three men who are going to kill this particular person, they make a mistake and they end up killing the wrong people. They realize their mistake not long after, when they return to town, and not only do they realize that they've made a really grave error in terms of whom they've killed, but also they realize that the person that was meant to be their target, Stuka, is in fact not just alive, but very much alive, and in fact staying in the same hotel that they are staying in town. So therein lies the crux of the plot, and it's all taking place over this very short window of time, starting on May 8th, 1945, and the surrender of Germany and the end of World War II in Europe, and thus the transition from wartime Poland into Poland that will usher in what we understand to be the influence of Soviet Russia into Poland, and what that effect will be, what the ramifications of this are to not just the broad sweep of history and the political change, but also the societal impact, and thus the psychological and emotional impact on the people writ large, and also on the individual spirit, as we see expressed in these various stories of characters, included in which are Stuka, Maciek, Andrzej, Krystyna, etc., as we meet them in the film, Drewnovsky, etc. So this is the essential context, if you will, of the plot of Ashes and Diamonds. So it is, in many ways, acting on so many levels, so many things at the very same time. And one can say, too, that it is a film that's focusing in on a very specific point in time that could be said to be a type of transition point. It's a transition point that is transitional in the sense of the broad sweep of history, the end of the war into a type of new order, one type of national or world order that is ending, and we have the beginnings of yet another national or world order, and what those consequences are for the state of Poland. And we also see, too, that there is a sense, because of the nature of the transition of this particular moment in time, we see characters that are both looking back and also looking forward. They are looking back to their time in the war with a sense of yearning, a sense of loss, a sense of sadness, but also a sense of a type of nostalgia. And this looking back in the context of wartime is expressed so poetically in very famous scenes in this film, Ashes and Diamonds. For example, there's a very famous instance of a scene at the bar, and we have Maciek and vodka glasses and lighting these glasses and each lit glass is meant to recall or commemorate or almost as a sense give life to their fallen comrades that they recall again in the war efforts. And this is also echoed in a very key song sequence that recalls the historical significance and aftermath of Monte Cassino. And so these and other moments are meant to be types of recollections or looking back in the immediate wartime era and what those consequences were to these people individually in terms of loss, sadness, and nostalgia and yearning, and how that echoes to a broad level and what that means symbolically and metaphorically in terms of Poland and the state of being and state of mind of Poland at this very point of transition, looking back with a sense of yearning, sadness, and also part of the idea of transition is not just looking back, but also looking forward into the future, what that will mean. And this story, too, is also echoed and represented both metaphorically and directly in a lot of the specific plot points of the film that we see. So, for instance, we have some of the characters like Drevnovsky trying to figure out what their place will be, what position they will be able to get, if any, in this new world order. And we also understand that this new world order may involve, or will likely involve, the influence and the filling of the power vacuum by the communists. And this then brings to the fore, or flies in the face of, those who are part of the Polish nationalistic army and the military efforts in trying to thwart and trying to protect what they perceive to be the best interests of Poland and the Polish people writ large, in trying to avert or avoid or push back any type of influence in terms of the Nazi forces and Nazi aggression, but also in terms of the Soviet communist forces and what that might mean in terms of the grand sweep of history of Poland in the post-war era, in the Cold War era. And so there is a lot at stake, both in terms of looking back and also in terms of looking forward. What it will mean for people, what they have to do in order to get ahead, their ability or inability to get ahead in this new world order, and what that means to them psychologically, spiritually, and also individually. And we see this again in terms of the broad sweep, but also in the intimate nature of their stories. And we see, for instance, what happens to Drevnovsky and what the consequences are, or what he perceives the consequences are to him. We also see this in the story of Maciek and Sztuka, because we understand that Sztuka, in this position of relative importance in the local level Communist Party, might be seen to be in a position of influence that will only grow in this post-World War II era because of the growing influence of the Communist Party in Poland, again, in terms of this power vacuum left behind from the aftermath of the war. And so this poses, in terms of a direct political threat, this poses a threat, theoretically anyway, to, and also realistically as well, in many respects, to the old establishment, or the order that was prior to the end of World War II. And this establishment is represented by various glimpses of the aristocratic classes that we see expressed in various character moments in the film. It's also expressed in terms of Maciek and his political affiliations and associations at the start of the film, but how those seem to be changing and perhaps morphing into a gray area, a nuanced, morally ambiguous area, where perhaps he is beginning to question the righteousness of his position, of his initial position, especially in this period of transition. And this is also expressed both in terms of metaphoric poetry and also in the direct relations to his own, say, emotional state and psyche, with the relationship that he begins to have with the barmaid, Kristina, and the hope and the aspiration and the potential for love and intimacy that this blossoming relationship, this very new and fresh relationship for him and for her, seemed to bring to the both of them. And what that might mean in terms of how Maciek perceives the future, what he wants and yearns for, and perhaps what he begins to yearn for, is something that he was maybe not yearning for before. In other words, if we were to think of the feeling of yearning from the viewpoint of characters like Maciek, prior to this end transition point, as being yearning for something of the past, yearning for some kind of glory, some kind of place in history and time, as expressed through their efforts in the nationalistic home army military movement on the one hand. That is one type of yearning. But now we have potentially another type of yearning on the part of Maciek with respect to his relationship to the young woman Krystyna, because of the idea of love, the idea of settling down, the idea of some kind of future, the idea of something away from the world of violence, away from the world of killing and murder. But of course that comes in direct contradiction with the immediate task at hand which he is ordered to carry out, namely the murder of Szuka. And going back to this particular story from which this film arose and began, namely the error of the assassination. And thus the source of tension arises, this way of looking forward. What will Maciek and company choose to do in terms of their looking forward? They look back and they see what they have done. Now they must look forward and choose what it is they will or will not do. And it is that choice that leads to various consequences, and those consequences, as I say, have this intimate nature, but that echo throughout a type of sweep of history that gives us these metaphorical and poetic and also very direct and very abrupt and stark considerations and comments and commentary and consideration and thought and pondering on the nature of the past, present, and future of Poland at this particular point, as depicted in the film 1945, or May 8th, spilling over into May 9th, 1945. But this is, I think, one of the levels that the film operates on, again, within the context of the environment of the universe within the film structure itself. But you also have to remember the context of the film in the time in which it was released. This is 1958, and we have Poland under quite a different political situation, Gomułka, and already we have the period of the late 1950s. We understand that there is this sense of the communist rule, but also a sense of perhaps a trend towards what is often referred to by historians as a de-Stalinization or a thaw. But of course that will lead into a different set of circumstances as we end the 50s and go into the 60s. But right now we're in the late 1950s. And so we have this consideration outside of the film as well as within the film. And these considerations are, I think, very apropos, and we will speak to those. In fact, the Criterion Collection commentary track and other supplements, I think, speak to this dual dynamic of the film very, very effectively. And we'll probably get to those some of those examples or details when we talk about the supplements themselves. But let me just explain one example here, which is Cybulski himself. Cybulski, who's playing the main character of this film, Maciek, he is very iconic. He is a legend, and he has this legendary status, which is perhaps cemented in large part due to his incredible performance in this film, Ashes and Diamonds. He has the dark sunglasses, and he's wearing clothing that we also understand later to be somewhat anachronistic. In other words, it's not necessarily clothing that is accurately reflecting of the period of time of 1945, but rather it seems to be more emblematic of the contemporary wear of Cybulski in 1957, 1958. And so we have this idea of this modern day actor performing this character that's set over 10 years in the past, in this very arguably different period of history within the context of the sweep of history of Poland. Nevertheless, we still have this film that is itself, therefore, a type of transition film. It seems to be a film that is looking back as well as looking forward. It seems to be a film that is dealing with two different dynamics. It seems to be the moral ambiguity or complexity of two sides of a type of factional conflict in terms of the nationalistic forces and also the communist forces, and what that means in terms of, again, a temporal a transition point. One side perhaps representing something of the past, and another side representing something of the future. And so, and if that's the case, then this film, both in terms of its construct, story, as well as its place in terms of cinematic history and its production, is all-encompassing in terms of the way in which it represents this notion of the transition, a cusp, something which has a past and a future, and we're at the very point where everything is about to change. And this point of change is also represented in the appearance and the existence of Cybulski himself, and what his role seems to represent in terms of reminding us of this. He is both past and future at the very same time. And when we think about this, these dynamics, and when we think about the context of Polish history, and when we think about the way in which the war and the post-war seem to have been so significant and brought about so much change within such a short space of time, I think we can realize that as a cinematic, poetic achievement, this film captures so much at once. It is about time and space and history. It is also about yearning and loss, and also about nostalgia. It is also about the war. It's also about the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new era, the end of one world order, and also the beginnings of a new world order, and how all of this affects the individual spirit and the concept of choice and the consequences of choice and one's actions, and how even one's individual choice has such a great and endearing and perhaps even significant and shocking and long-standing and echoing consequence, not just to one's own individual state, but also in terms of a metaphor and a work of poetry, and also a work of, say, political expression, how those individual choices have these dramatic ramifications across the entire spectrum of a people and a nation, both in the broad stream or the broad sweep of history, but also in terms of the individual stories. So this is a really powerful, powerful epic that is also a film that has these incredible dynamic shots, use of camera, use of deep focus, the way in which we have close-ups on one side of the screen, but also focusing in on distance in the shot. We have the use or the focusing in on ceilings and low-angle shots, or shots taken from a low angle up above, which is very much recalling various traditions of other aspects of world cinema, such as American thrillers or Italian neorealism, but also still capturing an essence of this Polish cinema spirit, driven by the artistic integrity and filmmaking elegance and brilliance of the filmmaker Andrzej Wajda. So it is all here, my friends, in this powerful, powerful work. Again, from 1958. This is the work Ashes and Diamonds. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Ashes and Diamonds, again. This is a film which has spine number 285. It was already released in the Criterion Collection earlier, in a DVD set, in fact. And such DVD set is right here. It is called Andrzej Wajda, 3 War Films. Ashes and Diamonds was one of the DVDs included in such set, which is right here. And we have on the cover of this particular DVD the artistic representation of a close-up of the face of Maciek, played by Cybulski. And here we have the new Blu-ray, which is purported to be based on a new 4K digital restoration. And we have different artwork, but it's still very provocative, and I'll get to this artwork later in this discussion, but it's very significant and very powerful indeed. But this is a great re-release or return of this film to the collection. I'm so impressed with this particular new release, this new Blu-ray, and so I hope this provides an opportunity for as many people to explore and examine and discover this incredible and important work as possible. The older DVD was great for many reasons. One of those reasons is, of course, the set had the other films in what is often regarded as a type of loose trilogy of sorts that has a war a theme to it. So A Generation and Canal being the other two earlier works. And so perhaps one of these days maybe we might see a re-release of those other incredible, powerful works themselves. But for now we have Ashes and Diamonds on this new Blu-ray. Now, speaking of that too, as with Criterion's other releases, we have a number of supplements as well to help us with this exploration of this brilliant work. So what are those supplements and extra special features? So first we have a commentary track, and this is described as being from 2004 by film scholar and professor Annette Insdorf. Now, this is a commentary track that we actually had on the earlier DVD, so it's carried over, but it is great. It is really, really great. Annette Insdorf goes into so much detail, and she gives us the historical context and background of the story itself, the Andrzejewski work, and how there are many similarities, but also many differences between the underlying work by Andrzejewski and also the film by Wajda. One of those differences is how each of the works treats time. There is a longer span of time, we understand, in the course of the Andrzejewski underlying work. But Wajda uses that and instead takes the amount of time and essentially truncates or shortens the period of time into this roughly 24-hour period, focusing in on the May 8th period of time. So this is very significant because it then emphasizes the nature of the historical and social and political transition. And this is at the very heart of the story of Maciek and Sztuka and Andrzej and others. So it's so important, both symbolically and historically and politically. This is a brilliant choice by Wajda. Also, another key difference that Annette Insdorf reminds us of, or indicates in her brilliant commentary track, is also how there seems to be a shift in the focus, because Maciek was only a minor character in the underlying Andrzejewski work, but here, of course, Maciek becomes, in essence, the main character of the work itself. And so this is very important, too, in terms of giving the spotlight, as it were, to Cybulski and his brilliant, brilliant performance here. Also, this may have had something to do with how this film was able or how Wajda was trying to create a film that, on the one hand, would be satisfactory to the relevant government censor offices that would be having the power to censor this work or to prevent it from being made, but it was in fact made. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But then another thing to keep in mind too is how Wajda would be using this film and using the story of Maciek in order to tell what kind of story he wanted to tell. And that is revealed in a lot of the details, a lot of the focus on Maciek, both at the beginning, middle, and the end of the film. And so this choice in terms of a shift in focus on a different main character, as it were, is another, I think, indication. And Annette Insdorf comments on this so brilliantly in the commentary track. So please check out the film with the commentary track if you can. She also provides a number of great historical details about the, for instance, This is the period 1958 of Gomuka, and also the period of de-Stalinization, again, at least in the late 1950s anyway. And she also speaks about the AK, Polish National Home Army, and how the characters of Drewnovsky and Andrzej and Maciek were or are associated with this particular military force movement, and how that leads them to the particular predicament that we find them in the start of the film, in terms of the assassination plot gone wrong, gone horribly, horrifically wrong, in fact, and also historically about how the AK forces were essentially fighting against the Nazi forces and also the communist forces, so, and how that latter part is expressed in the story of Maciek and Sztuka. And then also Annette Insdorf talks about the aspect of Sztuka and how Sztuka's story is very significant and very complex and so, I think, thoroughly dimensional, because we get a sense of his struggle, the notion of the Spanish Civil War backstory with him, and also the story of father and son, and also the moments of humanizing his particular story. So he's not a villain in this particular depiction. On the contrary, he's very much a human being, just as Maciek and the others are depicted as human beings. But therein lies, therefore, not just the complexity, but also the potential horrors of the various choices that these people make or don't make throughout the course of the film. So this is another fantastic element of the commentary track. She also speaks about other characters that have their particular subplots. The Drewnovsky character, Bogomil Kobiela, and a very famous actor in the Polish cinema scene, and also Kristina, the character of Kristina, what her story represents both in terms of this transition period, but also in the context of Maciek's story, and how it's beautifully drawn. There are some really famous moments between the two characters. In particular, there's a moment involving a church or a crypt area, and the two of them are walking in the late hours, and it brings about some very famous images, some of which is depicted, for instance, in the cover art here, in terms of the Christ image upside down. It's a very shocking and bold image that we see it depicted in this particular scene. Also, we have the reference to Norvid and the poem, which brings about the inspiration for the title "Ashes and Diamonds," as expressed in a certain English translation. For example, "Will the ashes hold the glory of a star-like diamond, the morning star of everlasting triumph?" And so what this seems to suggest, at least from the context or perspective of the great perspective of Annette Insdorf, for example, is that this is yet another way in which the film is showing or portraying or creating a type of emblematic sense of yearning and loss. Annette Insdorf gives us the word in Polish, which is tęsknota, yearning or desire, and how this is linked to religion and national identity, and a type of loss or sadness, a type of displacement. And this is somehow intertwined with the fate of Poland, especially during and after World War II, and the consequences and such, this bringing us back to that very notion of the idea of transition from one world order into another world order, and what that very tragic or potentially tragic set of circumstances are that such change brings with it. So, and another detail that Annette Insdorf brings to this commentary track is, which is so important because it's very, it's not immediately obvious upon watching the film. She recognizes and she reminds us that Wajda's depiction of both sides is very morally complex. For instance, this is a film, again, made in 1958 during the communist era, communist rule in Poland, and yet at the same time, this is a film that I think arguably, and Annette Insdorf makes this argument so beautifully and so convincingly. This is a film that maybe is not, while not necessarily looking at the communist characters as being quote-unquote villains or enemies, it is looking at them and depicting them for instance, I think quite strikingly in the character of Stuttgart, it is depicting them in a very complex and complex way, filled with depth and a sense of scope and breadth. And so Annette Insdorf describes Wajda's examination as questioning the role of communist rule, especially at this transition cusp point. Now then she brings up the very powerful detail of Wajda's biography and what happened to Andrzej Wajda's father, the hands of the communists. So this, I think, is a very interesting conjectural suggestion that perhaps Wajda's own viewpoint of the communist rule was very nuanced and very complex indeed, and his personal biography or a particular detail with regard to what happened to his own father seems to suggest this. At least this is what Annette Insdorf, I think, very, very convincingly is pointing towards. And so this is, again, yet another indication of just how maybe balanced, or maybe, or to use another word, how three-dimensional each of these depictions are. So there is not a sense of black and white, it's true 100% heroes, 100% villains. Everything is mixed and merged and murky and very ambiguous. And so there's a sense of questioning the order of things on many sides, on all the sides, in fact, that are depicted in this film. So, and also then going to the technical aspects as well, Annette Insdorf reminds us about how Wajda and company were very much influenced too by American cinema, for instance, the cinema of Orson Welles, Citizen Kane, and so the way in which the film is shot. We have deep focus, we have low-angled shots that expose the ceilings and things of that nature, very Citizen Kane-like shots, involve many people at once, both in the foreground and the background. There's also the Italian neo-realist realism tradition that seems to be expressed both visually and also in terms of the way that politics and society are being captured in a particular moment. And we also have, at the same time, a sense of the dynamism of Polish cinema in the hands of Wajda, as expressed in, for example, the appearance of people like Cybulski. So we have many trends of cinema seem to be intersecting all at once in the form of this work, Ashes and Diamonds. And for these, and she also brings up other great details as well, like the name of the hotel is Monopole Hotel, which translates into one people. But is this really a story about one people, one Poland, or is it in fact a fractured, factionalized depiction of this particular group, this particular nation? And will this factionalization, if it is indeed there, will it continue to become even more factionalized as history progresses? So that's an interesting detail that she reminds us of. Also, there's a particular moment where we see Cybulski drinking from a tin cup at the bar, and she says that this is actually his own cup, Cybulski's own cup. And so there seems to be this idea that reminds us too about how Cybulski's wear and wardrobe is very much part of the contemporary times of Cybulski rather than necessarily an attempt at being a portrayal of something authentic from 1945. But that is also part of the charm and power of this film. This anachronistic nature of Cybulski's performance reminds us about how this is a film about the past and also about the future, and how this is a film that is about the story and also about things outside of the story. And one of those details that reminds us of this is the little tin cup that he drinks from. So these and other reasons are really this is why commentary tracks like the Criterion's commentary tracks like this one from Annette Insdorf, this is why these are so great. She also talks about the white horse and the significance of the number 17, and so anyway, if you haven't seen this film with a commentary track on, I encourage you to check it out because it's great, absolutely great. So please check it out if you can. But that's not all, because then the Criterion Collection gives us in its supplements section a number of other supplements. And so those are, so first one is an approximately 36-minute maybe documentary or collection of interviews, I should say, from, it says 2003. And this is actually also from the earlier DVD. And this is actually a set of interviews with Jerzy Palzewski and Janusz Morgenstern and also Andrzej Wajda. And they're edited together, and they're each talking about their perspectives and experiences with this film, Ashes and Diamonds. And so we get a number of wonderful details that further emerge as well. For instance, the idea about how this is a story about ideological communists. That's one of the phrases of one of the interviews. And so that is, I think, another way to express the idea that this is a very multidimensional story about various sides of a type of factional confrontation or dispute. But it is very expressed in a sense of depth and scope. And the idea of how Cybulski was a type of figure for modern audiences while being in a story that was about the past. And so that wonderful dynamic between past and present and future is again expressed or embodied by the very nature of Cybulski himself. And there's mention too about, whenever Cybulski is mentioned, oftentimes he's described as being like the Polish James Dean. But what's really interesting about that particular expression, as set forth in this 36 minute set of interviews, is that there's a little story about how Cybulski actually saw a film of James Dean, and how Wajda and Cybulski were then talking about what the approach Cybulski could bring to this particular role. And so Cybulski, according to Wajda anyway, seemed to have been very much enamored by James Dean, and how this led the way for a type of emotionally brooding sense of performance that makes his work here very powerful. So it's a great detail to this particular concept. And again, the emphasis too on the importance of Cybulski cannot be, I think, stated enough. I mean, it's really significant. And so this is very important. Also, the consideration about the censors and what Wajda and company had to do in order to essentially get past the censors during the late 1950s is also touched upon, I think, with great sincerity here. And this leads to that wonderful expression by Wajda about how he dealt with censorship in Poland during, in Polish cinema, in terms of what the party would and would not accept and allow. And we are dealing with a subject matter or story, Ashes and Diamonds, that arguably speaking could be said to be very much looking down or being very much anti-communist in terms of Cybulski and who it is that he is tasked to kill. His character, Maciek, is assigned to assassinate a communist. And so if one therefore will sympathize with Cybulski's character, then what that will mean possibly is that one will not sympathize with the communist character. But we are also dealing with the underlying work, Andrzejewski work, and then also we're dealing with a novel that was very well known and very famous. And also we are dealing with the complex nature of the depictions of these various factions in the film, thus paving the way for various possible interpretations, one of which is seeing the communist characters in a very positive light. And so I think this is something that is hinted at by Wajda as one of his maybe strategies in order to try to get this film made and to avoid any kind of intervention from the Polish state censors, as it were. Also, this gives way to a wonderful expression from Wajda about how he tried to deal with the censors during his time, which is the idea of words versus images. How censors are looking at scripts and they can censor words, but it is a much more difficult proposition to try to censor images. And so what Wajda therefore says, the type of philosophy that he seems to espouse, is that in order to avoid censorship, one focuses in on images of a type of political import rather than words that seem to express that same type of political import. Thus, it makes it much more difficult for a censor to censor an image rather than a word. I think that's a very powerful statement about how Wajda approaches his cinema in specific terms vis-a-vis Ashes and Diamonds. So for these and other reasons, please check out this 36 minute collection of interviews on Ashes and Diamonds. It is incredible. So please check it out if you can. And that's not all, because then we get another supplement which is described as being behind-the-scenes newsreel from 1958. This is also found on the earlier DVD. I think it can serve too as a type of at the time, a type of trailer of sorts. It's not a trailer in the type of marketing sense that we might understand it today, but it serves as that type of advertisement for the film in a way. We see types of behind-the-scenes footage involving Christina character and the bar scene, etc. It's quite short. It's only about a minute or so, but still, it's a wonderful glimpse into the behind-the-scenes making of a particular moment of the film. Also, it's in a way a type of marketing for the film as well. So please check it out if you can. And then we have a video essay from 2020. This is once again from Annette Insdorf. This is approximately 12 minutes. We don't have this video essay on the earlier DVD, so this video essay is new. She is, Annette Insdorf is the same person who provided us with the brilliant commentary track. And so here she is again, giving us her great insights and revisiting some of her comments that she made in the commentary track. Also talking about other details, focusing in on, say, some of the other works in the so-called war film trilogy, Generation and Canal, reminding us too of how Cybulski appeared in one of those films as well. Also some of the connections, both visually and also musically. For instance, the focusing in on this flute-like ocarina sound of the music that we also hear in Populi Diamant, or Ashes and Diamonds. Also the work of Jerzy Wojciech is very important here in terms of the cinematography, the cinematographic look of the film. I mentioned too the fact that this is a very heightened expression of Polish cinema. Also, we understand that Wajda and company were very much fans of, say, Orson Welles cinema, etc. And this also shows in the way in which certain compositions and shots are made. Very dynamic, very bold, and very much filled with life and energy and political and social consequence. And also she talks about the archival images that are also found in the film. There's some moments where the characters are looking at like film newsreel footage of tanks, etc. They seem to be representing the end of wartime efforts, although Annette Insdorf, in fact, in the commentary track, actually gives us the detail. In fact, the footage is actually anything but check out the commentary track for that particular detail. It's fascinating. But she then also talks about the famous scene with the vodka shot glasses and the lighting of the vodka glasses, and how that's very much reminiscent of lighting of candles in a church. She reminds us of this, the religious overtones, the images of crucifixes and crosses and the Christ figures in the church, and also in the outdoor scenes, for instance, in the earlier parts of the film, etc. And how this is also maybe a sense of an establishment of a traditional order, but also the warping or the usurping of such traditional order because of the chaotic nature of the war and the aftermath that will come in the post-war period of Polish history. And also she speaks about the significance of Janusz Morgenstern with the vodka lighting scene as well. And she talks about the garbage heap scene, a very famous garbage heap scene, and the censors. And there's a certain detail about one scene involving the character of Stuka and his talking to various of the workers, and they're speaking about all the losses and the deaths and their families that they have all experienced at the hands of various factional forces throughout the war. And there's an interesting detail that Annette Insdorf says about this particular scene, again, according to what she heard from Zanussi. So, and then there's this final quote from Wajda: "Films will last longer than a butterfly." And then she reminds us too about Wajda's rich and brilliant career in filmography as well, Man of Marble, Man of Iron, of course, and of course Ashes and Diamonds. So a great great video essay, a return of Annette Insdorf to the discussion on Ashes and Diamonds. So please check this out if you can. It's really wonderful. And I should say too that the earlier DVD had some production photos and stills and posters as well. That's not carried over onto the new Blu-ray, but as I say, we do have those other supplements that were carried over, plus we have the commentary track as well, plus we have the new Annette Insdorf video essay. So please be encouraged in terms of this Blu-ray, because it's really wonderful. Also carried over, I should say too, is the essay by Paul Coates. It is carried over, although this time it's given a title which is called What Remains. But this essay originally appeared in the earlier DVD, and it is included in the fold-out booklet that's part of the Blu-ray. I'm not a fan of the fold-out booklet, but I am a fan when it comes to the inclusion of essays, including the Paul Coates essay. This is another great one. I'm glad they kept it, because it's worth checking out. And after you've seen the film, please read the essay. Again, it's called What Remains. It is another brilliant one. I should say too that the title, as it appears, Ashes and Diamonds, Popioi Diamant, it has the plus sign to indicate the and. It's not ampersand, but it's the plus sign, which is also reminiscent of how the title first appeared on the earlier Criterion DVD, by the way. You can see here it says Ashes and then plus Diamond. I should say that I was always wondering about that, to be perfectly honest, but I think about it now, and I think it's also very reminiscent of the cross. And if you know the film, you know that the images of the exteriors of certain church structures, and also the interior as well, the way that the cross is depicted in detail, or maybe as maybe in the foreground or in the background, is also very important. The religious depictions are very important in this film. So I like it. In a way, it's a subtle reminder of that, which I find very interesting. And then, of course, we have this wonderful artistic depiction. I think this is really great. We have this too here, which is one of the sides of the booklet here, and this is, we understand to be one aspect of the Cybulski character, the Maciek character, who's also, I understand, this character here on the front cover. This is really wonderful. I should point out too that when you open it, you have this side here, which would have the housing, the booklet itself, and the other side we have the disc. And so you have, when you remove the disc, you have the back, which is this white background. And if you look very closely, the white background was representing what looked like sheets, white sheets. And if you know the film, you know that this idea of white sheets is very important. And then when you have the disc, you see that the disc is red. And we have, if you look very closely, there's also a depiction of some particular scene on the disc as well. And this particular moment coincides, I think, very close in temporal proximity with this particular moment in the film involving the white sheets. And not only do we have this closeness and proximity of certain scenes that are depicted in this artwork, we also have the color scheme, and it is red and white. And there are many moments in the supplements, for example, Annette Insdorf, and also the 36-minute collection of interviews, where we have mentioning of the colors red and white and sheets, and the idea of red on white, and how in this particular moment in the film this is expressed so vividly and so dramatically, and how this recalls the colors of the national flag of Poland. And so this subtle detail is carried over into the cover art and design itself throughout this film, throughout this Criterion release. So well done, Criterion, for this brilliant detail. Genius, absolute genius. And so, my dear friends, this is the new release by Criterion of this important, critical, and brilliant, poetic, majestic, and complex, tragic, and overwhelming, and challenging, and dynamic work from the great Andrzej Wajda. This is the work Ashes and Diamonds. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.